Dr. Lincoln. So we're going to talk about some questions regarding hydroxychloroquine and some news that's been brought up about it. Personally, what kind of experience have you had with this drug?
So kind of start to finish, things started picking up around the end of February for us. And I remember texting our ID doc, he's our antimicrobial stewardship champion, so I communicate a lot with him. So I remember texting him and saying, do you want me to start getting some hydroxychloroquine? And all he said was no. So it's like, okay, we're good. I won't worry about it. Then more support, whether evidence-based or not, was starting to come out. So we started getting some hydroxychloroquine in the hospital. We pulled all of it from our automated dispensing units in the hospital. We put it in a controlled safe. And so we basically treated it like a controlled substance. So there wasn't any diversion. So then we started to reserve our supply for COVID-19 patients. And whereas we wanted patients to use their home supply if they were coming in, say they were on it for rheumatoid arthritis, lupus. But then we realized, there's more evidence for those indications than there is for coronavirus. And then the outpatient pharmacies were getting hit really hard with prescriptions for hydroxychloroquine. So we decided, we're going to keep back a supply for the patients that are on it at home so they don't have to worry about using their home supply here. And that's kind of when it started winding down maybe a little bit. And then we got a recipe for making the solution from the tablets. We never had to make it, thankfully. I coordinated the development of an order set. So providers had the tablet or the solution with or without azithromycin tab solution or IV. I reviewed daily hydroxychloroquine orders. And then this seems like it was over a 2 or 3 month span. This was like two or 3 weeks. And then all of a sudden my ID doctor was like, well, I'm not going to use it anymore. So it's like, okay, that's that. We're done with that. So that's kind of my experience that we had kind of through this pandemic.
Yeah, thank you. Also with that, you mentioned that the ID doctor providers were mostly the ones handling the situation. Mm-hmm. Are other providers also kind of doing anything about this at your hospital?
So in the beginning, providers would kind of one-off order hydroxychloroquine. And then we got a request from some other providers saying, we'd like some guidance on what we should be doing with these patients. So I actually made a guidance document and said, supportive therapy is the one that's most evidence-based, but here is hydroxychloroquine, the dose, and the available evidence for it. So we provided them with this document so they could kind of make their own decisions based on it. And we said, you should really talk to the patient about there's no FDA-approved medications for this. So really it's a collaborative discussion with the patient and the provider. So it's not just any man for themselves. And so that document included like Kaletra, loperamide, ritonavir, steroids, NSAIDs, ACEs, ARBs. So it included everything and kind of gave them information to use.
Okay, yeah. And with that, have you had any discussions or kind of talked to this could be patients, friends, family members, about their experiences when going into community pharmacies? Like, was there a change in anything?
I'm not very hooked in with the community pharmacies, but I can only imagine based on things that I saw on the news or heard that it was kind of it was crazy. They were restricting prescriptions for patients who were on hydroxychloroquine for an evidence-based indication. They were restricting their amount of refills they could have because they were trying to keep it for these prescriptions. And I can't imagine having to be the pharmacist in that position that's trying to triage, the data all by myself at the community pharmacy.
Yeah, definitely. So recently, the FDA did grant emergency use approval for the distribution of hydroxychloroquine to hospitals, but then as of Monday, they revoked that approval. How do you think this has affected the credibility of the FDA to you as a healthcare professional and then to just the general public when they see this news?
I knew this would be a challenging one, so I kind of thought about it. And so it's a very challenging spot to be in, being the FDA. We have patients, when they first did the emergency use authorization, it was very early. We had a lot of patients dying, and you're telling healthcare professionals that the best option is supportive care. It's really hard to not want to do something more for patients. So I think it was hard for anyone to be okay with the fact that we have nothing to treat these patients. And so this was the first thing that kind of came out as this is something that might work. So I think people kind of panicked, and that's really where all that came from. But just because there's data saying you should do something, I think it's always reasonable to think about it and decide for yourself. That's why a lot of our decisions on these agents for COVID-19 have been collaborative decisions. So I make sure the providers for any of these agents, are having the discussion with other providers involved in the care. So we have our primary team, our infectious disease consults, our pulmonologist, then the patient or caregiver. So that way you kind of get everyone's feelings and thoughts about it. And there's not one person making a unanimous decision about the care. So I think that's adding the FDA in there. It's hard to, the FDA says it, I'm going to do it kind of thing. It's hard to not follow what the Food and Drug Administration is saying. But you can look at other organizations, so like the National Institutes of Health and the NIH and Infectious Diseases Society of America, or IDSA. So looking at other organizations, you can see what they say. They take into account the FDA's release, but then they also said shortly after that in their guidelines that they didn't recommend hydroxychloroquine or chloroquine for use unless they were using it in a clinical trial. So trying to get some more of that data so maybe we can justify the use of this in patients. So it's always important, really, with anything to not just take one source of information and kind of run with it and make huge practice changes. It's always good to kind of see what are other things that are going on.
Yeah, and that's a really good point, and it leads kind of into my next question of, is too much focus on a single drug a bad thing, especially during a pandemic? And does that lead to bias when it comes to these researchers, scientists, and healthcare providers?
Yeah, so I think focusing on a single drug could be worthwhile, because then if you're having multiple things, so say you're adding steroids, you're adding NSAIDs, you're adding ACEs or ARBs, it's really hard to study that one drug and see if that one drug is effective. But then you can also flip it. Sorry, that was the other way. It's easier to study it because there's just one drug if everyone's focusing on that. But then if you have it the reverse and we have many treatment options, it's hard to see which one is having the most benefit. So recent studies either are having to include all the other agents that they're treating patients with, or they're having to exclude patients that have had other treatment options, have had other treatments. So it's limiting your patient population for your study. So you're not getting as big of numbers as you would like. So it kind of goes both ways. Focusing on one or focusing on a lot has its pros and cons.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and leading to my next question, how do you think pharmacists become key players in this situation? So starting with the beginning where this news was released that there's a new breakthrough treatment for COVID-19, and all of a sudden everyone is wanting to get this drug. How do you think pharmacists are essential in this situation?
I think we're the key literature people, really staying up to date on literature. I remember when this all kind of started happening. I'm really glad I got on Twitter last year in October. And so when this started happening, I was on Twitter every morning. I was on Twitter every night, staying up to date on all the literature, what's happening now. How can this impact my institution? So when remdesivir stuff started coming out, we're a smaller community hospital. Is this really going to impact us? And originally it wasn't, because we weren't going to get a supply. And so I think taking the information that's available and then applying to your patients and your patient population. And if you really get familiar with the literature, you're able to correct misinformation as well. So you have everyone kind of having their interpretations of the data, but the more you know it yourself, the more you're able to speak to it and kind of correct the spread of rumors or misinformation. Let's see. Yeah, I think that's all I had on that one.
And then I know we talked about earlier, but the Lancet article that was retracted due to inconsistencies in the data. How do you think this affects, firstly, the opinion of healthcare professionals? Because it is a well-known, the Lancet is a well-known peer-reviewed medical journal, and we typically look at these as primary sources for when we collect data. How do you think this has really affected us?
Yeah, so I think I mentioned a little bit, as healthcare providers, we're advocating for patient safety, and we should review all available data before we're making big decisions that impact our practice or our patients. So all of these articles, basically since the end of February, even in January, a lot of these articles have been coming out pre-print, so they're not being peer reviewed. So all these articles that are being retracted kind of brings to light the peer review process and why that is so important. So typically in the peer review process, an author submits an article, it's assessed by an editor, it's sent to multiple reviewers, and they all review it, send it back to the author to make edits. So this is where you get your validation of your data. So that's what happened with the Lancet article. People were looking into it, and other places that were studying the same thing, the hydroxychloroquine, were not finding the same data that they were. And so they audited their data basically, and they couldn't produce it. So that's what caused the Lancet to retract the article. And there are actually a couple other articles that the same data company reviewed. So that's why. So it's always good to know the more data is in the article is the better, because they're being more open with what their results were. So it's just good to take it with everything with a grain of salt right now, because most things are preprint, and that's why we've kind of started reviewing these things as a group. So we formed a pharmacy and therapeutics and dietary committee subgroup for novel COVID-19 therapies. So when things like this come out, we kind of take some time to digest it, and then we meet as a group, pharmacists, providers, nurses, physicians, to talk about these things. And then at the end, we kind of come together with a consensus statement on what we're going to do as an institution. So I think that's helped our providers a lot, not have to interpret this data for themselves and see what they should be doing.
Yeah, that's a great point. And I definitely do agree with how everything has to be met with a consensus and how multiple people should be reviewing these new studies. Mm-hmm. This also leads to how the general public gets their hands on these studies. And when they read it, most of them, we as pharmacists, we go to school to learn how to read these studies and analyze it. But the general public, they don't really have these skills. How important is it, do you think, that we take the time to kind of educate the public, or kind of let them know that these are things that they can't use these are things that they can't really rely on if they don't really understand it?
Mm-hmm. That's a really good question. How do we get this information to those that maybe can't read, but can't interpret an article or evaluate an article like we've been trained to do? No, I would share things on Facebook. I have lots of wide net on Facebook, but what other kind of advocacy could we get out and do? Because the news is where these people are getting most of their information, and the news is so biased, and it's really one side or the other. So it's really hard for them to get a really good, this is the data, this is what it said, and this is how it impacts you. So I'm not sure how to do that, but that would be something really good to get out to people.
And then leading to kind of the next part of this hydroxychloroquine news. Now, this drug has a very negative view from the general public. How would you say, when this news broke out, how your hospital is handling uh, this situation?
We haven't really used it for a couple months now. So I don't think it's impacted us too much. I know patients that are on it at home, they're still taking it. And I did realize we still have it loaded in the safe. We could probably put it back up on the floors again. But as far as negatively impacting patients or having a negative viewpoint on it, the patients that were taking it before COVID-19, I think they're still pretty okay with it. They know the risks when they take it for their chronic medical conditions. We did have a patient in the ER. A provider was going to prescribe it, and the patient kind of refused to take it. So I was like, oh, that's probably okay. Probably is not going to work too well for you anyway. But I don't think it's had too much of a negative impact on the patients.
That's good. Let's see. And then my final question that we'll kind of wrap this up with is basically, do you think hydroxychloroquine has a chance of being trialed again for COVID, or do you think there's a future for it with this pandemic?
It's a very good question. We actually talked about this today. One of my students that I have on rotation with me, she did a journal club about the retracted Lancet article. So we were talking about this earlier today. I think it's going to be really hard for a randomized control trial to come out now that the FDA has removed the emergency use authorization. And it's going to be really hard too now that we have all these different treatment modalities, so convalescent plasma or remdesivir, to get patients that are solely on hydroxychloroquine to see, because there was recently, I think it was this week actually, that an article or a study came out saying that remdesivir and hydroxychloroquine together, they kind of antagonize each other. So that will be really challenging now that places have more access to remdesivir, to be able to get patients to just trial them on hydroxychloroquine.
Yeah, thank you for your insight. And thank you so much for participating in this podcast and kind of answering some questions people had and discussing more about this and how we as pharmacists are helping with this pandemic.